on the chat window. If you have a specific question to a particular panelist, please do write with that panelist name. But if you have a specific question to all the panelists, then you write that specifically also. And we will be taking up your questions at the last 15 or 20 minutes. In this webinar, we are looking at not in terms of advents of psychometric or what kind of psychometric or when did psychometric assessment come in or inventions or different type of psychometric assessments. We are going to talk about psychometric assessment and coaching and what allows the assessment to be effective and what are the efficient usage of this, what do the coach brings to the table along with the psychometric assessment, how does it aid, and what are some of the things that may be in fact even blocked by psychometric assessment. So we will look at both sides of psychometric assessments, and people who are here, I couldn't think of people better than them to talk about these these subjects. I would like to welcome Ramanathan. Hello, Ram.
Hi.
And I would like to welcome Ramanathan. Ram doesn't really need any introduction, but Ram is the founder member of Coacharya, and he is a mentor coach. He brings in 45 years of experience to the helm of Coacharya. He's a leadership development coach. Ram works with groups and individuals on issues of team building, alignment of culture, values, co-creation of vision to action plans, strategic performance issues of engagement, and coping with VUCA. Ram has authored several books on Eastern philosophy. In fact, he's extremely passionate about this and integrating Eastern and Western philosophy, and is published innumerable articles internationally on awareness, mindless awareness in coaching, and I was quite interested. He teaches as an adjunct faculty at postgraduate programs and speaks at events related to human development. Next is Uday Khedkar. Hi, Uday. Uday is a founding partner, senior facilitator, and director of Life Learning Solutions Private Limited. He has been facilitating top leadership, transformation, team alignment, and executive coaching at the CXO, senior and high potential manager levels across various sectors in India and across the globe. Uday is passionate about the journey of transformation, and he integrates somatic intelligence, mindfulness, and non-violent communications in his work. Extremely interesting, as you can see. Ashok is the managing director of Reflexive Lenses. He's the author of EUM framework. He's an IMA alumnus and an organization consultant based in Bangalore. Ashok is my colleague as well. So we know him as a researcher at heart, as a person who's great at communication, and a consultant who facilitates organic evolution of organizations. Ashok, apart from writing several papers on academic and general interest, Ashok has authored 2 books, Child Man, the Selfless Narcissist, and Indian Managers and Organizations, Boons and Burdens, both published by Routledge. Without much ado, I would like to hand over this to the 3 panelists. And my starting point to 3 of you is that as you have been doing coaching both with and without psychometric assessment, and as you look at executive development, leadership development in India and abroad, how do you look at assessment? How do they help? What is that the coach brings to the table? And what has been your own experience? Over to you. Ram?
Okay. First of all, especially in the coaching space, I work with international organizations in terms of accreditation and training. ICF, practically everybody knows, International Coaching Federation, European Mentoring Coaching Council, not as many people know, and very few people know about a Center for Credentialing Education, which is board certified coach. They are probably the 3 largest institutions in the world. Strangely, even till today, ICF is in denial in accepting assessments and evaluation as a core competency as far as coaching is concerned. Whereas EMCC very clearly accepts it as a core competency in coaching, that you need to be able to evaluate and assess as you are pursuing your coaching conversation or your coaching journey. And board certified coach is also, to some extent, there is an acceptance of the fact that assessments need to be used. So this is very interesting. So when I discuss with people who are the movers and the shakers of ICF, it's almost as if, it's necessary. We talk about in something like a competency of agreement, we talk about that the outcome needs to be evidence and so on and so forth. But beyond that, in terms of the larger context of coaching, whether in a session, in a journey, it is being evidenced, is totally unclear. So to that extent, I personally believe as a coach, from day one when I started coaching, this was an area of extreme importance to me. Not only for coaching, and we're also in coach training in a big way, and therefore learner evidencing, learner assessment, learner evaluation is also equally extremely important. And one of the major considerations we have is right from the beginning, we start with using assessments to help people understand who they are. So in that sense, I would put it this way, my own philosophy in using assessments in coaching is not as an aid to the coach, but to the aid to the client. My first perspective would be, does the client quite understand who he or she is and where he or she is coming from? Because to be a good coach over a period of time, our own learning in Coacharya has been, and thanks to our own learners, is that self-coaching is probably one of the most powerful way of enhancing one's own coaching competencies, even if you're a coach, and also to enable the client. And that is what really anchors the coaching as well. This is a second thing which ICF is not particularly strong in. ICF talks about the session much more importantly than the journey. And there is no coaching as in one session. Nobody is going to get completely changed from a past habit in one session. They may get the awareness, no doubt. You can, in 20 minutes, you can bring awareness, so-called laser coaching. Is it going to stay with you over a period of time? Is it going to be anchored and embedded in you? That will only happen through action learning over a period of time. And this is where I think a continuous evaluation is also of tremendous help. So personally, in my usage, I set far more importance by 360-degree evaluations, especially in a corporate context, to be able to understand, which is an extension generally of any kind of a Johari. And more work that I do is in the systemic coaching, which is why I'm much greater fan of EUM than any other kind of assessment that allows us both to provide some amount of individual awareness, maybe not as strongly as something like a Hogan does, but certainly a reasonable awareness in terms of where one is headed, what kind of a culture that one wants to have, and also the larger systemic approach. But the mainstay that I work with very often, because that is the cheapest, and many free tools are available, 16 personalities and so on, is MBTI. And unfortunately, this is something that we can discuss over a period of time. The misuse of MBTI is far greater than its use. People who claim to be certified, I remember one of my trainers was making a presentation, and when I was in the room, I was horrified that in the chart was being shown, and it was from a very reputed trainer in MBTI, that you can use it for selection of candidates, for example, which is totally untrue. MBTI very clearly says this is an area that don't even venture into. And so there's a lot that can be done. So each one of these tests, I think, has a very specific area in which it's of great value. And the most important thing to do is to allow the client to decide for themselves where is it that they are getting the maximum value. And just be, as a coach, which we are supposed to be, handhold and perhaps explore using what the results are. What do you understand from this? At least that's the way that I work. So I'll stop here, let Uday and Ashok and continue, and then after that come back as we discuss more.
Thank you, Ram. I think one of the things that you said very importantly is that nobody's going to get completely changed in the journey. So continuous learning is extremely important, and that's where the assessment comes in. Uday, I would like to hear what has been your experience and what are some of the views that you have.
So largely, I would say it's been an amazing experience. If I have to start at the client end, most of the clients I encounter are looking forward to some touch and feel around the journey that we're getting into. So right at the beginning, if there is something that they've done a self-assessment on, there's been a 360 degree, I think it gets the conversation started off in a different way. And several times I use it along with the life story. So there is a good tying in of life story, challenges, etc., all coming together. However, I would say there are a number of other factors which come into play and which determine whether it's really powerful or not, the usage of the assessment framework. One is the framework itself. How good is it? Validity, the reliability of that. How accurately does it actually map out the human experience? Second is ability of the coach. Is the coach using that to box people in, or is there actually an attempt to really blend in with the person's life and intuitively join the dots, bring everything together? Third is the person being coached himself or herself. At times, this is not very often, but there are times when there is an attempt to show a certain side of the self. So authenticity is very critical in that am I really willing to be straight with myself? And in some areas, I may be completely off the mark and it's not even gray. It supposedly in the eyes of the world may look black, but am I willing to actually assess myself as that? So at times there may be a holding back. Second is that maybe the blind spots could be such that I'm not able to do justice to marking the assessment. So this is related to the coach, the person being coached, and the third aspect is the organization. At times, the organization also plays a role in terms of the trust. At times, a question may be raised, is this really confidential? Am I really safe being honest over here? If I have to assess my colleagues in a 360, then how freely can I do that without it being traced back to me? And I've seen that in a few large organizations where it's resulted in extremely high positive scores being given for everybody. It's almost when you norm it. I was using the leadership circle over there. When you norm it, it looks like they're the best in the world, and the reality is far from it. So I would say it's an amazing, opportunity. However, there are several factors which need to be tied in before one can say that, yes, this is something that is really going to make a difference in the coaching journey.
Absolutely.
That's what I would.
Absolutely. Thank you, Uday. I think in all that you were saying, two things that stayed with me. One is you saying the framework itself, and how does it, apart from the validity, reliability, which everybody looks for,
Sure.
but something that you said, not very many people say that, and how does it map out the human experience? So when you say, how does it map out the human experience, how do you tie that in? For instance, if I were to be devil's advocate and say, okay, why don't I just need to only know about myself? Why do I need to look at human experience in an assessment as a coach? What would be your response?
So if I were to really look at it, the way we approach transformation as well as coaching, I mentioned that life story plays a very critical part. And as you go through the life story, there is a certain way that an identity gets formed. And there is a certain commonality. So whether it's a Mercedes or a Maruti, the engine dynamics remain the same. So if we are actually able to map those out, then of course there is a certain uniqueness for every individual in the interplay with people, your self-conversations, your interplay with the organization and various systems. So I would say that's where the human experience becomes very critical. So for me, the experience of EUM has been amazing. So EUM has been one, and second has been the leadership circle. These are two which I found amazing. And what Ram mentioned, even about MBTI, there was a certain point where I used it extensively. And if used in the correct way, it's amazing to actually map out the human experience. What actually happens out there. It's not removed from the reality of what human beings go through.
Thank you, Uday. I would now come to Ashok for Ashok's views on this.
And I think a lot has been said by both Ram and Uday, and I generally concur with almost everything, and I could relate to what each one of them is saying. I think one of the things which struck me as very significant is a comment made by Ram that the assessment is supposed to help the coachee and not the coach. It is not being done for the coach's benefit. Oftentimes, people use assessment to get an understanding of who the coachee is and what the coachee is. And when it is used in that manner, it tends to precondition your experience. In fact, that is one of the difficulties of psychometric assessment, that the very fact that we have seen it, it in a sense predisposes you to understand and interpret the coachee in a particular manner. On the other hand, as Uday said, when you use it correctly, how you use it to initiate a certain area of exploration with the individual, and how the individual gets triggered by that assessment or whatever, and starts. So it's not really assessment in the sense, it is often, and again, if I go back to what Uday was saying, oftentimes assessment is seen as evaluation. And much as I may say about many of these frameworks, no matter what their intent be, and particularly in some of the frameworks like, if I may, like the Big Five, or to an extent Hogan, I've often seen them being used more as assessment, more as evaluations rather than assessments. And the entire thing of, emphasis on, okay, tell me what my strengths are, what my weaknesses are, it pushes it into the realm of more evaluation than assessment. And the more it becomes evaluative, the less are the possibilities of it being used for exploratory purposes, for initiating a certain kind of a dialogue with the person. That's one of the things which I think is. The second thing is that many times I've seen, the emphasis goes on individual elements rather than how the elements relate to each other. EUM, of course, is based on the very, concept of interplay between various elements. But even in other instruments, like my first exposure to, or, using psychometric assessment in a manner of speaking, was with Fairobi. Even in Fairobi, where you're looking at 3 dimensions, anyone who has used Fairobi would know that meaning of one dimension changes significantly in relation to another dimension. A high expressed control has a very different meaning when it is accompanied by high expressed affection. High expressed control has a very different meaning when it is accompanied by high wanted affection or low expressed affection or whatever. So how they interplay. So in many ways, even in those days when I was doing only Fairobi and those 6 numbers, they used to tell a story, and how the story sits with the individual and what resonances and dissonances, get created in the individual is, to me, very important. So that's the other significant thing in using psychometric assessment, that many times, it becomes only a confirmation or a disconfirmation of what the individual believes about himself or herself. Yeah, this describes me accurately, or this does not describe me accurately. Well, that's not the idea. The idea is not to say whether the instrument has captured you accurately or not. The idea is whether the instrument or the assessment enables you or evokes you to ask some questions of yourself, generates a certain curiosity, or what we call a certain process of self-reflexivity. To me, that's very important, that a psychometric assessment ought to be used, deployed in a manner that it evokes self-reflexivity rather than a mere boxing or understanding of an individual or an evaluation and stuff like that. So that's what my approach to it would be.
Thank you, Ashok. I think again from everything that you have said, one sentence that stayed with me, and I think it resonates with what the other two have said, is that how does one tell a story that resonates with the individual? And I think one of the things that, in India and maybe even abroad, but certainly in India, I think coaches consciously or unconsciously also become a bit like gurus, whether we know it or we don't know it. And then people who are getting coached also have a certain orientation. In India, there's a leaning, not that everybody does it, but there is a certain leaning to look at the coach as one who knows me better than myself in a certain way. And when an assessment is added to that, how does one kind of create an exploratory, like you're saying, create a dialogue process? And also, could an assessment make a coach dependent on the assessment rather than experiencing the person fully? And this is a question to all three panelists.
Ram, Uday, any responses?
Yeah, Shabri, okay, before we come to the specific question that you asked, I think based on something that Uday said as well, and some of the questions that are being asked, and something that Ashok said, let's look at it. If you look at pedagogy or andragogy, whichever you want to do, from a learning theory, it's about assessment is classified as normative, formative, and summative. Okay. Assessment is never considered to be evaluative. So Ashok talked about evaluative assessment. Yeah, surely it's a synonym, but it doesn't mean that you bring judgment into it. A normative assessment could be again certain criteria that we have set up, which is okay when you are learning a skill. It is not okay when you are doing it in coaching. All assessments in coaching, unless you are in coaching training and stuff like that, where we differentiate between these three, is just formative. It is developmental. It has to be generative. It has to be client-centric. It has to be empathetic. It has to be unconditional positive regard, whatever Carl Rogers says and all that stuff. So some of the comments which have been made here, like Gagandeep somewhere says that the dependency and so on and so forth, would only happen when your coach thinks that I'm using this as another tool. But if I were to look at it differently, as I said before, that I'm using it for the client at a point in time to sort of center himself, herself, where that person is, and create an awareness. If I want to move from point A to point B, at this point in time, I'm point A, where am I at? And my belief is that you don't have to use any of those FIROBs or discs or MBTIs or anything of that sort. The other day I was discussing with, some of you may know this person, Suman Nair. Suman is doing her MCC program with us. She used to be the president of APAC Coaching Association and all that stuff. She's really an expert on Enneagram, and she believes in it passionately. I know quite a few other people, including Peter Hawkins, who believe in it passionately. So one of the things she was saying was, you don't have to take the tests of Enneagram. And if the coach has the Enneagram background in mind, just through questions, you would be able to establish what are those 9 situations a person falls in. Same way today, I can have a conversation with somebody for about 15-20 minutes and be able to establish whether that person is STJ or NFP or whatever it may be. It doesn't require it to be put down into answering a question with 16P or whoever it is. Ultimately, I mean, then that ties up with what you're saying about human experience. It's a flow, it's a dynamic flow. Earlier, it used to be thought that if you read Jung's original book on personality theory, somewhere he says, it doesn't change, which is totally untrue. He himself had to eat his words later in another publication where he said the MBTI characteristics are changeable, and everyone's lives, if you have measured it like I have over a period of time, and I have measured it with other people, it does change, either by trauma or by learning. I used to be an STJ, today I'm a complete NFP. And also the labels don't mean a damn. When I hear someone say STJ, it's meaningless, because if you're between a 40 and a 60, it doesn't matter where you are, it's situational. You might behave as sensory, or you may behave as intuitive. You may be T, or you may be F. You may be anything.
Sure.
So unless you are highly significant, anything over 70 or something, it doesn't even, it's idiotic to talk about you belong to one of these 4-letter words, which is totally untrue. And there are multiple things that you need to know the subtlety of it. Whether, if you take MBTI, for instance, that STJs form 24%, twice what the norm is, 6% each, 12, it should be 24. On the other hand, NFPs are only about 3%, NFJs are about 4%. So you need to know what makes people tick. What's the difference between an NFP and an NFJ? You need experience. So multiple things define that.
Yeah. So Ram, I think the question that is coming, but a large number of people I think are coaches here, and there are some interesting questions. One is, of course, this, that whether the coaches can look at the thing that Gagandeep has already talked about in terms of whether coaches have a certain bias towards this. The second kind of thing that people are also saying that the psychometric test may get interpreted differently by different people undergoing it. And the same question or the same result may be understood differently by different people. So how does the coach kind of deal with that? The question to all three. Uday, Ashok.
So if I have to share briefly, I touched upon it earlier.
Yeah.
So the way I use either it's EUM or the leadership circle, there is a life story element in it. There are shaping experiences in it. And there is an attempt to get down into the core beliefs of an individual. Okay, so when a person has himself or herself discovered that, the tying in with the framework or whichever assessment we are going to be using is something which actually sticks. It makes a lot, oh, it's showing up over here. I'm getting this kind of a feedback from others as well. So we are going through the whole process in such a way that, yes, there is a good chance that there is a certain acceptability which comes.
Ashok?
There are very many interesting things. And let me begin with what you had said about coaches being seen as gurus.
Yeah.
Now, one of the corollary of that is when coaches are seen as gurus, often the psychometric assessment is seen as a horoscope.
Yes, absolutely.
The horoscope.
It becomes a horoscope. That's it's seen as a horoscope.
True.
In fact, the other day, someone was, sharing it. She had done a EUM with someone, and she had come to me and she's talking to me in terms of, trying to get my inputs on this person's EUM. And she said, look, this person is saying, now spill it out, give it to me. And I was telling her, look, no, that's not the way it works. Because the moment you look at it as horoscope, the emphasis goes on accuracy or inaccuracy of that horoscope. Is this horoscope accurate or is it horoscope inaccurate? I'm challenging the very paradigm of this. I'm saying psychometric assessment is not intended to be an horoscope. It is not intended. So therefore this entire thing, and I know in today's market, this entire thing of scientific rigor and this and that, and how accurate it is a huge selling point. But to me, that actually defeats the purpose of psychometric assessment. Psychometric assessment, after seeing that assessment, the individual should say, is it me? Does it sound like me? Yes, to some extent it does. To some extent it doesn't. What new questions does it raise about me? What may be some of the things that I have not been looking at? What could be some other possible meanings which are derived in it? What new doors does it open for me? If the assessment does not do that, then I think it serves no purpose. No matter how good a horoscope it is. As a good horoscope, yes, it may make you feel good or bad or whatever else. That's another kind of a matter. And I think that's where the moment it is treated as horoscope, even the coaches then tend to look at it and what Gagan has called the dependence, that rather than trust your own experience, rather than your own ability to listen to the story, you would then say, okay, this is what one kind of story which is coming. This is the other story which I'm experiencing in my actual engagement with the individual. What may be some of the things, new avenues of exploration is it opening? For a coaching perspective, the primary aim of a psychometric assessment ought to be opening new doors for exploration. Not to interpret, not to put it in a fixed meaning. Because, you know, just by doing that, it serves no purpose. You're just putting another label. You're giving a label to a phenomena. Just because you have labeled a phenomena, it doesn't mean that you have either understood that phenomena. So a person may, for instance, feel very good that, okay, I am this type, or I am that type, or it is like this, or, but it has only put a label to it. It hasn't helped you to understand the phenomena. It hasn't helped you to go beyond that phenomena. So psychometric assessment, at least in my understanding, ought to open new doors for exploration, not just stay with get caught. And the more it gets caught with accuracy or inaccuracy, the greater is the problem. That's the way I know.
Thank you, Ashok. I have a related question that has come from the viewers, which is somewhere related to all three of you, and how have you experienced it, saying that some CEOs in systemic coaching seek evaluative and prescriptive outcome, you know, when taken through, say, EUM assessment for their core team or any other assessment. And so this coach is saying personally he is okay with their discomfort, but how do other coaches experience? So how have you experienced this when people are actually seeking prescriptive outcome from assessments, especially CEO and their teams? I can see some laughter there with Uday and Ashok and Ram. It's an interesting question.
Let me start with this. See, that is very true. In the job of an executive, and I was one for several years, is to find solutions, is to troubleshoot, to take decisions. And therefore, the executive will always have a question, hey, I'm paying for this. At the end of it, what is it that you're saying? Sure. Now, and what Ashok says is absolutely right. But on a lighter note, let me put it this way. Since I have read Bhrigu and dabbled in astrology at a point in time, astrology is not about prediction. It's about probabilities, and it's about also personalities. And it's about exploration. The same way, if you treat assessments as Ashok put it, horoscope rather than a horoscope, then you're going to have a problem. And essentially, I think I haven't yet come across a CEO with whom I have had an honest discussion and tell him how wrong some of these on-the-spot judgments can be unless they can be explored further. So whether it's in teamwork, systemic work, individual work, whatever work there is, you start using assessments as a starting point and not as a defining endpoint or interpretive kind of stuff. So this is what is coming up. So what's coming up for you? What do you think? And that is where the life history part of it comes in. Do your past experiences justify what is being said in this? And those of you who are familiar with Hogan, you know that it gives us a spread of 30 to 70% as a safe zone, and the two extremes can be unsafe in one way or another. And the red ones talk about the high stress kind of this thing. Is it really happening with you? In these kind of situations, is this how you behave? If you're a good coach, you should have the sense to be able to ask those kind of questions. And if you do that, then someone has asked here about different people can interpret different things. So that doesn't matter, because you are going to put it back to the client and ask them with respect to their own life experience, is this how it is, rather than trying to interpret it in whichever way they want. So, like, again, going back to what Ashok says is that, yeah, use it as an exploratory tool, as an awareness creation tool, rather than developing a dependence on it, saying this is going to provide a solution for you.
Thank you, Ram. Thank you, Ram.
I have this thing about what people look for normative what solutions or tell me what to do kind of a thing. I personally, the easiest way I find of dealing with it is to actually give it to them. When a person says, okay, tell me what should I do, I will say, I'll tell you what you do, because you can be sure that a person who asks that question will invariably, no matter what you offer to him or her, invariably will come up with a yes, but response. Oh, yes, what you are saying is true, but you see, this cannot happen like this. I would do that yes, but for exploration. So rather than block it and say, no, this is not for it, because it goes into a spin. Because you can be sure that there is a yes, but response is coming your way. Use that yes, but response and work.
You're saying call the bluff, basically.
Call them. That's right. You are calling the bluff without actually calling it.
Calling it bluff. Absolutely. Yes, Uday.
Yeah. In fact, one of the things that I do in expectation setting very clearly is talking about what's the domain of coaching, what are the boundaries, and what is it that I'm going to do, not do, what does the coachee need to do, not do. And typically the thing arises, so what do I do next? So the whole ontological coaching model which I use talks about the source of where the action comes from. So as your life has unfolded, what kind of an observer of life have you become? What perhaps are the belief systems that are playing out in this? So unless there is an inquiry into them, it doesn't really make any sense to get into actioning. And that's very clear right from the word go.
That's right.
So really shaping the conversation in such a way that right from the beginning, whether he's a CEO or a CXO or at whatever level, can one really start looking at it in that fashion? That we are exploring the observer that you have become, which gives you a certain limited set of actions. It's valid that you want to take other actions, but shifting the observer is that, firstly knowing the observer and then shifting the observer is what we would be actually dwelling on. Whether it is through the somatic route, whether it is through the EQ route, whether it is through the language or the belief system route. It's a combination of all three.
So I think there was one corollary question to you there from the audience, is that, when you're saying life story, can you say more about life story and, assessment? And the second is, for instance, when you're working with a team or, in all of these, there is a life story or an identity of the team or the organization as well. So how do you tie that up? And a third, and not a corollary, but most of the time, coaches are called in by the organization. So there is a question of livelihood, there is a question of professional relationship, and so on and so forth. So how do these coaches, for instance, manage this while they are using assessments? Where is the scope of collusion, not collusion, etc., etc.? This is not exactly directly related, but
So two questions I hear you ask.
Yeah.
So one is related to the life story.
That's
so yes,
right.
of course, engaging with the organization to assess what's the culture like really, because the system definitely is going to have an impact on the individual. At the same time, when the person's life story has evolved in the context of self as well as others, what are some of the things that have been shaped? What kind of an observer have you become? So just to give a simple example or a simplistic one, there is somebody who's become conflict averse. And life has actually shaped, or the impacting experiences have been such that the person has ended up as being conflict averse. And the observer that that person is looking at every situation where a full expression is needed as threat. So there is an emotion of fear that shows up. There is a tightening of the body. There is a belief system which says that conflicts are dangerous. Let me not go there. So just telling the person that, okay, instead of this action, next time, you must relate to an individual as equals, and you don't seem to be doing that. So one more point I want to bring up over here is psychometrics, again, tying to what Ashok has been talking about. Can it lead to the next level of exploration? Because many a times the what next is not very clear for most people. So what next? So it's a very logical question. So what do I do with all this? So how do I support an exploration as a coach? How is it that I am actually able to enable that? through my listening, through my questioning. So that would be my take on this.
So are you also saying that, what does the coach do then? So when you're asking as a coach that what kind of observer have you become, who is the coach then?
A coach is a facilitator,
He's a coach,
I would say.
okay,
He's an
not
enabler.
a meta observer. Is it a meta observer? Is it an enabler? Who's the coach?
So I wouldn't get into the technicalities of these terms. I'm a person who's actually a space in which exploration can happen.
Okay. So you're facilitating
and at times yes, I'm facilitating that process. And yes, it's not coming from a place of I know something more than you. It's more out of deep listening and being curious. How is it that I can actually evoke a certain level of reflection, thinking, awareness? That's
okay. Ram, you're smiling. Is there something that you would like to add?
I'm looking at Gagandeep's observation. In exploring the observer, you become the observer to the observer to the observer to the observer. Takes me into the Turiya state. So Gagan's, it's a very interesting command. It can be a virtuous and vicious cycle. And I think Meenakshi earlier talked about the same thing. Assessment can be a double-edged sword. I know when I reflect on some of these questions, maybe it's a bit philosophical, but I'm a student of Zen, and in Zen, the thing is that in the beginning, everything seems so simple. In the middle, as you are learning, everything becomes so complicated, and in the end, everything becomes very simple.
Absolutely.
So in the beginning, I didn't know anything about assessments, and when I started using assessments, oh my God, I mean, it can be so good, it can be this, it can be that. Today, pretty much, I don't use assessments at all. I think they make no sense to me in individual coaching, to be honest. I can do the same thing without depending upon any kind of a formed assessment. Most coaches can, believe you me. We are working with literally hundreds and hundreds of people in training coaches, and we have today found that in 30 hours, we can train them to PCC level competencies, and I can guarantee that. And primarily, we do that by giving them the basics of what we need to look at. Like Ashok said, it's all about exploring, sharing, observing, feeding back, simple things of SET, sensations, emotions, and thoughts, and stuff like that. Now, yes, there are situations where you need to use assessments. If you are working with someone who's working in a group of people in relation to that team, how does the team look at that person? Because very often it's very difficult for that person to be aware of those blind spots of Johari, for example. So that is really where the powerful listening of assessment come in, not in terms of exploring, in my personal opinion, the life story of the individual as they are, to whatever extent they can do. This is my opinion. Where EUM therefore resonates for me is because the larger the environment with which work, it doesn't, however much I completely agree with people who say that you have to interview, totally correct. In fact, my experience was before I came into EUM, I was using Barrett, and I found it's extremely confusing in terms of what people had put there. And then I had to interview each person, and later a person who had worked for their whole lives with Barrett and told me, that's the way to go about it. Don't worry about what Barrett says. Go with what the people say. My question was then, all this is rubbish? Yes, no, but use it as a guideline. Okay. Whereas when I worked with EUM, I found there was a far greater resonance because there was an aspect of individual, there was an aspect of larger things, and even though Ashok may not want to call it a horoscope, but the DTM matrix, for example, was able to give me an idea about the company, which was much deeper than all that individually was available. And I was tremendously impressed by it. And I've shared that this thing with you and Sarbari, with you and Ashok as well. When I was working with a company, Ashok worked within 3 days, gave me back a report. And normally when I do systems work, I would like them very, very positively to share and talk about all your good things, the wonderful things that you have done. And from there, how do you move, bring positivity and all that. And here, what Ashok's findings were from EUM was that this particular group of people, they are all diplomatic. They are putting everything, sweeping everything under the carpet. and they're not wanting to confront each other and so on and so forth. So when I spoke with the CEO and the CHRO, they were very, very open. They said, I told them, look, if I were to just take that very appreciative, client-centric attitude as it is defined, I'm not sure whether I'm going to get anywhere. Would it be okay if I light a bit of a fire under their butts and ask them difficult questions or whatever it is? And it worked wonders. In just 1.5 days, we reached the point.
This meeting is being recorded.
What happened?
I don't know. This
Okay.
meeting was,
So the whole issues which had been festering for several years got resolved in a period of time. So I guess as coaches, we need to, at some point in time, learn how to use these assessments, not go by what the assessment creators are marketing themselves as.
Thank you. I think that's very important. Now, there are two questions which are kind of related to one another, to all three of you. In what is the situation in which a coach will call for a psychometric assessment for a coachee, which may not be a sponsored or corporate coaching? And what do you think is the take on possibility of ideal self-answering in the assessment and the real self-answering? So two things. One is, what is the situation in which you would call for a psychometric assessment for a client? And what is the possibility that you think, what is your take on the possibility of people actually answering ideally as if rather than as is?
Well, I can answer that, at least the second one, in the context of EUM, because in EUM we consciously differentiate between the two.
Yeah.
We ask the person to say, well, the way you see yourself and the way you would ideally like to see yourself. Further, but at a more generic level, the more non-normative, I don't know what's the right word for it, the more, if the social desirability of the, underlying instrument or framework is, not very high, then it becomes very difficult for the person to fall into the trap of the ideal self as such. Like, if I may again talk in the context of EUM, our work shows that by and large, the 15 words we use have a reasonably balanced variance in terms of social desirability. Some are a little more desirable, some a little less, but the gaps are not so huge. So it becomes that much more easier for the person. So you can't really say as to which is this is better or that is better. To some extent, the person, what is there in the mind will then come through in terms of the self-current and self-ideal. But most importantly, it comes through in the context of EUM is through OP. Because it is through the gap, because in EUM, what we insist upon is that it is not a statement being made in isolation. It's a statement being made in a context of the worldview that you hold and the self-ideal that you consider yourself to be a part of. Unless you take those into account, only then you can have a complete picture of it.
So what you're really saying is that it depends on the way that the instrument has been designed.
That's right.
Okay.
In terms of how it deals with some of these.
Okay. Uday, Ram, in terms of, Uday, what are the situations in which you will call for a psychometric assessment of a client?
So in my experience, more often than not, the client is very clear that they want some kind of an assessment so that there is an objectivity. That's their background. However, there are occasions when it's a one-on-one which is happening, one-off kind of thing. And during the chemistry meeting or in the initial 1 or 2 meetings, if there is seen a tendency for being final about one's own views, if the coachee is coming across as a person who's very, very clear about, yes, this is the way I am, and this is what I really want to work on. So curiosity doesn't seem to be there at times. So how does one really open up that world? So one of the ways in which that could be opened up is through an assessment, and at times in a 360 degree. How is it that the world views you? And what Ashok pointed out, yes, the EUM is brilliantly designed to look at both. This is how I am, this is how ideally it is. So I would look at the state of the coachee as well, not as a formula that it has to be done. Of course, as I said earlier, there are organizations which insist that this is an assessment needs to be done. And really engaging with the organization to find out what exactly is the need behind that. And yeah.
You see, also there is one other thing which I would again link up with what Ram was saying a little while earlier, that why any experienced coach really does not need a psychometric assessment per se to be able to figure out as to where this individual is, what this person's preoccupations are, etc., etc. However, where a psychometric assessment helps, and I'm linking with what Uday is saying, is it provides you a new lens of looking at the same phenomena. It gives you a different meaning. Coaches also have their own patterns of meaning making. They are attuned to making meaning in a particular way. And a coach would be making meaning of the coach will observe for sure. But the meaning making, when you are using an assessment, you are, as a coach, so the curiosity that Uday is talking about, curiosity both in the coachee and the coach, that you kind of set up and say, okay, here is another way of looking at the same phenomena. Here is another possible meaning of that phenomena. It expands that.
Absolutely.
Just to give an example, there was a chief executive I was coaching, and he seemed to be very convinced that, you know, his next in line completely sucks. However, not able to see the blind spots. And whilst engaging with him, I could uncover a couple of them, but it was very uncomfortable to begin with. So really to expand the scope and look at how does his team also view him. We eventually agreed that, yes, let's do a 360. So there can be a new exploration, which goes beyond saying that I don't have a competent team. So how does one really enable? So that's the situation where definitely either an EUM or...
So there was a question related to UMI saying that how do you kind of build trust with the UMI scores among our team members, you know, which is related to what you're saying in terms of blind spots or so on and so forth.
What is the question? How do you build trust?
Yeah, how do you build trust using, explore the trust challenges between core team members based on their UMI scores?
You see, like,
comparison.
Like I'll tell you what is it when we use UMI in a group. How do we do it? Maybe that will probably partly answer this question. So what we do often when we are using UMI in a group setting is that we ask people to do UMI for themselves. We also do another exercise, which is a kind of a mini 360 degree on the basis of EUM only, where we ask people to give certain ticks and crosses. Then we put this profile of the individual for the group to look at, and for the individuals to talk about their experience of this individual, and for the individual to reflect upon the story which is emerging from the profile, the person's own experience and its interaction. Now, what it does is, it is not that the perceptions around the individual change a lot. What it does is that suddenly people start seeing new meanings in the individual's behavior. That where is this particular thing coming from? For instance, there may be a perception about the individual that this person is not very collaborative. Now, when we look at the person's, EUM and the person, and when this dialogue, etc., takes place, then what you say that what has been labeled as non-collaborative is actually maybe a way of this person's timidity, shyness, unwillingness to, hesitation that will I be seen as intruding into someone's space? So where is the individual? So when you start seeing, so the real process is of meaning making, because people tend to give certain meanings to their own and other people's behavior. The moment you release yourself from the old meanings and look at the possibility of new meanings. And I think psychometric assessment in that sense can be of great help. The patterns of engagement and interaction and consequent trust can change.
Thank you. I would like to actually, is there anything else that you would like to say, Uday, Ram? We have 5 minutes left. And if there is any last, kind of questions, people are giving their feedback.
Very quickly, Sarbari, the simple thing that I use is, if I have to ask the client to pay for any psychometric test, I would never ask them to do. I don't think they are worth it, period. Because if the coach is good, if the coach is charging you money, it's the coach who has the ability to do what the psychometric test does. I'm being absolutely brutally frank.
Absolutely.
There are some situations like 360, yes. And so what I do is I have a standard 360 template. So I supply to them. So if one of you can act as an anonymous person and to be able to gather that and come back to me so I can interpret that for you. Most of the others, sure, they all add value, but do they add the value to the amount that they charge? I have no idea, because I think there is a tremendous amount of misinformation that can also be there. So you really need to be very good at it. And the second is, there was a question about the real and the ideal. I understand what Ashok is saying, but the ideal is okay, it's pretty easy. But the real is, yeah, well, even Shankara couldn't figure out who the real was. So it's all Maya. So if you're trying to figure out the real through some kind of a psychometric, best of luck to you. That's all.
Uday, any last word?
So I would say that it's useful, related to a certain context, and yeah, it's a tool. How you use it is completely up to you.
Thank you.
Can I just add one thing?
Yes, sir.
I think what needs to be understood, that when one is talking about real in the context of psychometric assessment, what one is saying is, this is the person's self-perception.
Absolutely.
This is the way the person is seeing himself or herself. It's not real as a, real qualities or reality in an absolute sense. And this, I think, is a distinction which oftentimes gets lost. People take it as real in an absolute sense, rather than saying that this is the subjective reality of the individual. So long as the real is understood as subjective reality, I think it's.
Thank you, Ashok. Thank you, Ram. Thank you, Uday, for spending your valuable time and make this a very interesting and fruitful webinar. And we will be, and thank you everybody else for attending this. Absolutely super audience. And it's been very energizing for me. So to all the others, we will be doing this once a month, and we would be uploading the video, and we'll be sharing the video, and you please go ahead and share with whoever you think are important and somebody who may like to look at this. Thank you very, very much once again.
Thank you, Sarbari. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, all the other people.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, people.